New York Ranger fan favorite Tyler Motte is an impending unrestricted free agent. Will he be back with the Blue Shirts, or will the Rangers let him walk in free agency for the second straight offseason? Plus, Peter Laviolette is currently in New York, and could Patrick Kane be back with the Rangers after undergoing a hip resurfacing procedure? All that and much more on today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers. Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 841 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's go ahead, dive right into it. Tyler Motte, unrestricted free agent for the New York Rangers, one of several free agents this offseason. Going to be a very, very interesting offseason, interesting couple of weeks and months here for the Blue Shirts because, obviously the salary cap situation is tight, and there's a lot of difficult decisions that need to be made, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're breaking all that down on the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. And today, we've already covered Patrick Kane. We've already covered Vladimir Tarasenko. It's time to move on to Tyler Motte and kind of just look at the situation here and talk about, could the Rangers want him back? Should they want him back? Can they afford it financially? What are some other factors that might determine whether Motte is back with this team or not? And so for some quick recapping here, look, obviously Tyler Motte, a very popular player in a short amount of time. The last two seasons that he spent with the Rangers, and of course, wasn't even 2 full seasons. It was the second half of each of the past 2 seasons. He came over at or near the deadline in each of the last 2 years. But this past deadline, Tyler Motte was acquired from the Ottawa Senators in exchange for Julien Gauthier and a conditional 7th-round draft pick. That pick would have become a 6th-rounder had the Rangers gotten out of the first round of the playoffs. They, of course, did not do that, so it remains a 7th-rounder for the Senators in that trade. As far as, statistically, what he did during his time with the Rangers the second time around here, 24 games with the Rangers this past season in the regular season, 5 goals, 5 assists, so obviously 10 points, was also a +2 in that time, 17 block shots, 30 hits, 11 takeaways, and 5 giveaways. He averaged just 11 minutes and 4 seconds of ice time per night with the Rangers, but he tended to make those minutes count. He's a noticeable player, kind of a buzzsaw out there, and again, just plays a style of hockey that has really kind of won over Ranger fans for the most part. I know there's at least going to be a few Ranger fans that are going to look at this and say, look, it's okay to let Tyler Motte walk. You can replace him with somebody inexpensive. I get that perspective too, but I think for the most part, Ranger fans warmed up to this guy in a heck of a hurry in each of the last 2 seasons because, as I said, obviously he came over at or near the deadline in each of the last 2 NHL seasons. Of course, then in the playoffs for the Rangers, no points for Tyler Motte in the 7 games. But as we all know with Tyler Motte, it really is not about offensive prowess or points. He can chip in there every now and then. And honestly, he's one of those guys that even though he doesn't score that often, I always feel like it looks like he's getting close. It could happen at any minute. That's just kind of the perception that I've had of Motte, in the time that he spent with the Rangers over the past 2 years. But regardless, you're not going to get gaudy offensive numbers, but you will get somebody who plays every shift like it's his last. I used to say that about Jesper Fast a lot. He's one of those guys that really stood out in that regard. And of course, Fast had a fantastic postseason for the Carolina Hurricanes. He himself is about to become an unrestricted free agent. And when we kind of open up the floor a little bit, we're going to talk about, I think, the Ranger free agents first, and eventually we will work our way to free agents from around the league that the Rangers might have some interest in. Jesper Fast might prove to be too expensive, but we'll at least talk about him and talk about, Foss, the possibility of a reunion with the Rangers, but keeping the spotlight on Motte here, again, just a buzzsaw, does a great job pressuring the puck, very good defensive forward, very good defending around the blue line, very good penalty killer. He tends to kind of take a beating out there, but he always gets back up and comes back for more. He's one of those guys that I think has the respect and, the fondness of his teammates. He seems to be a popular player in that locker room. Just one of those glue guys, man. One of those guys that just does a little bit of everything and just kind of holds the team together. Not a superstar by any stretch of the imagination, but one of those guys in your lineup that kind of keeps the team honest because he's going to go out and he's going to give everything he can on a night in and night out basis. And unfortunately, in the playoff series with the Rangers, we saw too many examples of players who just were not doing that. Certain nights they had it, and other nights they were just kind of ghosts, didn't really show up, never really were able to find that fifth gear. But Tyler Motte, look, obviously he didn't have any points in the playoff series against the Devils, but I thought he was one of those guys that was going out there, giving it everything that he had pretty much every night. And that also obviously holds true for the regular season as well. And I will say it was kind of interesting, I thought, watching Tyler Motte in each of these past two seasons. The season comes to a conclusion. Last year it was in the Eastern Conference Final. This year, obviously, the first round. But, all the Rangers are being interviewed, and all the reporters go around, and the impending UFAs, the unrestricted free agents, they always get asked the question, do you think you could be back here next year? Would you like to be back here next year? And, as I mentioned in the past, players are mostly going to keep it pretty close to the vest there because obviously you don't want to say anything bad about the organization. I think that pretty much goes without saying. You also probably don't want to overplay your hand a little bit and make it sound like, oh my God, yeah, I'd love to stay here. That would be awesome, because then they can kind of lowball you a little bit if they know that. So what you get are kind of like these, almost like these tepid endorsements of the team, and like, yeah, if things work out the right way, then, I guess maybe maybe I might be back. That's kind of how it usually goes with these exit interviews. But it was interesting watching Tyler Motte, I thought, last season versus this season once each of the seasons concluded. Because if we go back 2 years ago, the season that ended when the Rangers lost to the Lightning in the conference final, that season, among all the unrestricted Ranger free agents, and I'm talking about Braun, Kopp, Vetrano, and Motte, watching all their interviews, it felt to me like Motte was the one that kind of played his cards closer to the vest than any of them. He was very respectful, and he kind of, left open the door as far as maybe coming back to the Rangers, but it's not like he was jumping out of his shoes and talking about, yeah, I'd love to be back here. This year, I thought it was kind of the opposite. This year, he is asked about it, and he says, yeah, I'd love to be here. That's pretty much what he said. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but it just felt a little bit more obvious this time around rather than last time, and you guys can let me know if you noticed this as well. But it just felt like this time around, man, this guy wants to be here. He wants to be a New York Ranger. He enjoyed his time here. When he was traded from the Senators to the Rangers this past deadline, he talked about having unfinished business here, and maybe he still feels that way and wants to stick around. And it's interesting because 2 years ago, once again, the season, you never know what to say, like 1 year ago, 2 years ago, because the season that just ended. So is this now last year, or is this year? I don't really know. But the season that ended in the Eastern Conference Final, when Tyler Motte became an unrestricted free agent, he was out there for quite some time. He lingered in free agency, and not that he's a superstar, but he's too good of a player to just not find a home. And I'm thinking that maybe he was trying to maybe see if the Rangers would open the door back up for him and let him back in. There was some conjecture about whether or not the Rangers might trade Ryan Reeves to make room for Tyler Motte, which they kind of did. It just took them longer than we thought. Obviously we got to the trade deadline this year, and that's when it happened. Reeves was gone by then, and Motte came back home to the New York Rangers. But in just a second, I want to keep everything rolling here. I do want to go ahead and throw out a prediction as far as whether or not I think Tyler Motte will be back with the Rangers next season, whether or not he should be back, the whole 9 yards, what it might entail to keep him around. We'll get into all that in just a second, and just break that down as we do every single New York Ranger free agent. But first, we got to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Buying tickets to your favorite events should not be stressful. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for all the fun that you are about to have. Gametime is the place for last-minute ticket deals. Forget planning months in advance. Gametime has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. Get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. The Gametime guarantee means you will always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. It's the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. Get images of your seat before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Buy tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps, and you're all set. Snag the tickets without the stress with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, we just want to go ahead and thank everybody, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And for the everydayers, make sure you stick around. This is Friday right now, so obviously it's the end of the week here. But next week, going to continue talking about New York Ranger free agents. Going to probably start looking ahead to the draft. I mean, we're down to less than a month away from the NHL draft. A whole bunch of other good stuff as well. Obviously, the Ranger coaching search. We're going to keep close tabs on that. And, just kind of see how that whole thing shakes out. I get the feeling the announcement could be coming next week, so definitely stick with Locked On New York Rangers for that. But for right now, let's keep the focus on Tyler Motte. As far as a prediction, does Tyler Motte stay with the New York Rangers for this upcoming season? I hate to say this, but I get the feeling he's probably going to walk again. And it's too bad, too, because I really like that fourth line that the Rangers put together. It was just worlds better than really just about any fourth line that the Rangers have had recently. I mean, certainly any other fourth-line iteration that we saw this year. You had guys like, and no disrespect to any of these players, but you had guys like Ryan Carpenter, Ryan Reeves, who, I'm a big fan of Ryan Reeves, does a great job, but clearly he was slowing down. He does a great job, as being a good teammate and being an enforcer, but clearly he was slowing down a little bit. Dryden Hunt was out there who, again, hardworking player, plays with a lot of guts. I think, though, he probably is not at the same level as any of the three guys that the Rangers put on the fourth line at the end of the season. You could probably say the same thing for Johnny Brodzinski, another really hardworking player, does a great job as the captain of the Hartford Wolfpack. But that fourth line at the end of the season, you had Tyler Motte, Barclay Goodrow, and Jimmy Vesey. And it's too bad that, barring something unforeseen, we're probably not going to see any more of that trio out there. It's possible that Jimmy Vesey is the only one left at the start of next season because, as we've talked about, Barclay Goodrow is certainly a trade candidate. The salary cap is so tight right now, and I'd hate to see Goodrow go, but I would at least understand the move if the Rangers felt like they had to make it. He's a gritty player, works hard, and frankly, he's the kind of player that the Rangers need more of is Barclay Goodrow, and probably you could say the same thing for Tyler Motte as well. But as things stand right now, it's not that the Rangers wouldn't want Tyler Motte back, and he is coming off of a contract that paid him just $1.35 million, so you probably hear that and think like, oh man, just give Tyler Motte $1.5 million, what's the big deal? And yeah, on the surface, that's obviously not a big commitment, especially if it's 1 year, in terms of length or amount. But as things stand right now for the Rangers with their salary cap space, they currently have only 14 players under contract. They have $11 million remaining for up to 9 players next year. That's if they carry 23 guys on the roster. The NHL minimum salary next year goes up from $750K to $775K, and I think you're going to see at least a couple of guys making $775,000 for the Rangers. It's really the only way to squeeze everything in under the cap. Think about like Ryan Carpenter's a good example. They brought him in 1 year at the league minimum of $750K. Didn't really work out. He ends up playing the vast majority of the season with the Hartford Wolfpack. But the Rangers are going to have to find other, bargain basement kind of players to fill out the roster. And Tyler Motte, even though he doesn't make that much, I think he might just end up being a little bit too expensive for the Rangers. Now, of course, there are a couple of X factors at play here. As we've mentioned, talking about, Kane and Tarasenko in some recent episodes, we don't know what the salary cap is going to be this season. And obviously there are some big time ramifications for that, for the Rangers, for every team in the NHL, for basically every player in the NHL. We don't know for sure what it's going to be. And obviously, if you're a Ranger fan and you want to keep this team kind of intact and you don't want to see these guys get away in free agency, you don't want to see the Rangers have to trade somebody like Barclay Goodrow or Ryan Lindgren, then you should be rooting for the cap to go up as high as possible. And if you want Tyler Motte back, the same thing applies. You would want the cap to go up, and then all of a sudden, if the cap jumps up another $5 or $6 million, and I don't know if that's realistic or not, but if it does, then the idea of re-signing Tyler Motte, all of a sudden it's not so far-fetched, and it's something that you could quite a bit easier afford if you are the New York Rangers. But the other big-time X factor here, I've been talking about Kane and Tarasenko on and off throughout this episode. Are they going to be back? I would think probably not, certainly for Tarasenko. I think the Rangers would like to have Tarasenko back. I know a lot of you want Tarasenko back. I just don't think it's realistic as far as how much he's going to cost. That's even if the salary cap goes up. It's going to be really tough to figure out a way to make that happen. So he probably walks. But if either Tarasenko or Kane comes back, then there's kind of a ripple effect, and it probably limits the chances of Tyler Motte coming back, because now you're paying, a decent chunk of change, you would have to imagine, to either Tarasenko or Kane. But if both of them walk, I think it increases the chances of Tyler Motte potentially sticking around on, a fairly inexpensive and fairly short-term deal. And, I never begrudge really any player that wants to go out there and just sign with the highest bidder. Most players, that's what they do. Every now and then you'll see a player take less to go to a certain team. Artemi Panarin's a great example of that. He took less from the Rangers and chose not to go to the Islanders, who were offering more. But with Panarin, he's choosing between $11.6 million per season with the Rangers, or just a little bit more than that with the Islanders. So yes, there is a difference. And some guys, again, would just take the highest amount no matter what it is, no matter what team it is. And anybody who wants to do that, more power to them. But for somebody like Tyler Motte, the idea of giving the Rangers a discount. Look, Tyler Motte this past season, I say he only made $1.35 million, which, hey, nice way to make a living, professional athlete making seven figures, very nice. I think most people would sign up for that. But compared to his peers, it's really not that much. And, if you're in a situation where the Rangers are only going to offer him, say, $1.3 million per season, and somebody else is going to offer him $1.8 million per season, who are you going to pick if you're Tyler Motte? Be honest with yourself. You're probably going to go to the team that's offering a little bit more there. And again, money isn't everything, but that is a pretty substantial difference. And again, Tyler Motte, yes, he's making a lot of money in general, but not so much compared to his peers. And, getting into his late 20s now, I'm sure Motte wants to, clean up as much as he can. I mean, why would you not want to do that? I will throw out an idea here, though, and it kind of is going to borrow from what the Rangers did with Vincent Trocheck. It's going to be on a much smaller scale because, Tyler Motte per season is not going to make as much as Vincent Trocheck is. I think that's obviously fairly certain there. Yeah, the idea, though, is that you kind of model it after the Trocheck deal. Trocheck ended up getting, I believe it was 7 years from the Rangers, and the reason the Rangers went that long, or at least part of the reason, is they wanted to keep the average annual value within reason. They wanted to keep it at an area that they were comfortable with, and a way to do that is you offer somebody more years. They take a little bit less money per season, and the Rangers can kind of circumnavigate the cap by doing that. Now, Tyler Motte obviously will be on a much smaller scale, but when you consider the fact that Tyler Motte was a free agent forever last year, only ended up taking a one-year, $1.35 million deal, is it now possible that Tyler Motte would consider a longer deal with the Rangers, but for a little bit less money per season? I just mentioned the league minimum next year will be $775K. Could the Rangers talk Tyler Motte into a 3-year deal worth $1 million per season or $1.1 million per season, somewhere in that ballpark where they're just a little bit above the league minimum? But, Motte obviously would have a little bit more stability. It'd be a longer contract. He'd be making less money per season, but he would also know he's got more money coming to him in the long haul, and obviously he can get comfortable. This guy's been bouncing around the league the last couple of seasons, the last 2 seasons alone, from Vancouver to New York to Ottawa, back to New York, and we'll see if he ends up somewhere else this season. But I do wonder, if the Rangers, if they go a little bit longer on the length of the contract, would that be enough to convince Tyler Motte to, again, just sign for $1 million, $1.1 million, somewhere in that ballpark, so that way the Rangers could save some money against the salary cap. Now, part of the other issue with that, and I know some people are going to bring this up, is do you want Tyler Motte to block the roster spot of a Brennan Othmann or a Will Cooley or one of these other prospects along the way? I think it'd be okay to do that. I think Offman and Cooley will find their way to the Rangers regardless. And if it ever really comes down to it, you could always trade Tyler Motte. I don't think Motte is the player of the stature that's going to end up with a no-move clause. So if you ever feel like you need to make room for one of your prospects, you could trade away Tyler Motte. Not to be cold-blooded or anything, but that's the nature of the business. That's the way things go. Players do get traded. It happens all the time. And obviously, if the Rangers felt like they needed to do that to open up a roster spot for somebody else, that's an avenue they could explore as well. But it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with Tyler Motte. I do think he's got a better chance than most of the Ranger UFAs. I would say he certainly has a better chance of being around than Tarasenko, probably better than Mikkola and probably better than Halak. I get the feeling the Rangers might end up with a different backup goalie next season, given Halak's age and the fact that the Rangers really need to save money anywhere they can, and backup goalie is a great example of that. But going to be very, very interested to see if Tyler Motte sticks around, and I kind of talked myself into it here. Give Tyler Motte 3 years at like $1.1, maybe $1.2 million per season if you feel like you can afford it. We'll see if that's an avenue that the Rangers look to go down. But going to keep everything rolling in just a second here. We want to turn our attention to Patrick Kane. He had his hip surgery, so we're going to talk about that and how that could affect his free agency, whether that increases or decreases his chances of staying with the Rangers. And I also want to talk quickly, about Brennan Othmann and the Peterborough Petes still competing in the Memorial Cup. And we're going to do all that good stuff in just a second. All right, let's go ahead, keep everything rolling here. So Patrick Kane will be out between 4 and 6 months after having hip surgery. What's kind of ironic about this situation to me is that I think that it might honestly increase Patrick Kane's chances of staying with the New York Rangers, the fact that this happened, because the fact that he has hip injury, the fact that he had hip surgery and he's going to be unavailable for 4 to 6 months, that means that it's going to probably eat into the season next year, or very well could eat into the season next year. And so, there's some uncertainty. How is he going to come back from that hip injury? He was going to have a very interesting free agent market regardless. But now the fact that he's going to be missing some time next season, or certainly could end up missing some time, how does that affect things with the Rangers? Because it feels like overall, that'll drop Patrick Kane's price. He won't be able to get quite as much money, quite as much length as he might otherwise be able to get if he was going to be ready to go for sure at the start of this upcoming season. So I mentioned when we did our Patrick Kane free agency episode, and you can go back and check that one out if you'd like, but I mentioned that the idea of a 1-year contract for Patrick Kane really intrigues me, and I wonder if it might intrigue him as well. He's not getting any younger. This is going to be his age 35 season, and it's kind of weird to think that, an established superstar, a slam dunk Hall of Famer, a multiple-time Cup champion, has to sign a 1-year prove-it deal, but that's sort of where it's at with Patrick Kane when you consider the fact that this was his worst season in the NHL, and when you consider the fact that he's got the hip injury. So I wonder if Patrick Kane might take, a 1-year deal with the Rangers on a high average annual value, or at least a decent average annual value, sticks around, and this is where he wanted to be, right? This is the only team that he was going to approve a trade to. He wanted to come over, play with his buddy Artemi Panarin. Presumably, he wants a chance to win the Stanley Cup. So, we'll see what happens. I'm very, very curious to see how that affects everything. But honestly, yeah, as I just said, I do think the fact that he got injured and might be missing some time next season, the fact that there is some uncertainty, that might make it more likely, in fact, that the Rangers would get him to stick around on a 1-year deal. I don't know about going any more than a 1-year deal, though, but if you can find some common ground, I at least be open to it. And again, something with Patrick Kane, we've talked about this, it felt a little bit off between him and the Rangers, but maybe a full season here in New York, a full season to get acclimated to the new city, his new teammates, the whole 9 yards, apparently a new coaching staff. We're going to have that soon too. But hopefully that would bode well for Patrick Kane if he does indeed stick around. And for what it's worth, it's called hip resurfacing surgery, or a hip resurfacing procedure. And his agent told reporters that Kane had the surgery on Thursday and that Kane still wants to play for a long time. His agent also said that Kane would consider all options if he does not have a contract on July 1st. July 1st at noon, of course, is the start of free agency. Always a fun time. And then this is straight from an article from ESPN.com talking about Patrick Kane. It just has ESPN news services in the byline, so there's not really an author that I can credit here, but this does come from an article on ESPN.com. It says, hip resurfacing is an alternate to hip replacement. According to the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, the femoral head is not removed, but is instead trimmed and capped with a smooth metal covering in hip resurfacing. So, as we've established on here, I am not a doctor. I am certainly not a surgeon, but it sounds like, the hope is that this would basically make him good as new. And I guess there's, you can't ever really say there's any guarantee when it comes to things like this, but it sounds like this is something that could certainly help Kane. And again, going to have a very, very intriguing market, regardless of whether he's back with the Rangers or ends up with some other team next season. But we'll obviously keep our eye on that. Going to be one of the bigger stories of the offseason as far as what happens to Patrick Kane and if he's back for round 2 with the New York Rangers. I did want to shift our attention to the Peterborough Petes and Brennan Othmann before we call it a day here. As we discussed in our most recent episode, Offman and the Petes, they won the final game of the round-robin portion of the 4-team Memorial Cup tournament to stay alive in that tournament. That put them into a tiebreaker on Thursday, and in that game on Thursday, they beat the Kamloops Blazers, 5-4 in overtime. The Petes were actually down 4-1 in that game as late as 7:50 of the second period, and it was right at that time that Brennan Othmann scored unassisted. Petes went on to win that game, as I said, 5-4 in overtime. Othmann in that game was also a +1 and had 6 shots on goal. With that win, Othmann and the Petes are actually, it just started, in fact. It probably just started. Othmann and the Petes playing the Seattle Thunderbirds in the semifinal game tonight, Friday night, and the winner of that game plays the Quebec Remparts in the championship game at 4 p.m. on Sunday. So curious to kind of follow along and see how Brennan Othmann does. I'm just having a lot of fun watching Brennan Othmann play in all these, junior leagues and just put up these ridiculous numbers. He's the one Ranger prospect that you can look at and truly believe, like, this guy could be an absolute superstar in the NHL. I don't know. You never know for sure, but I don't see any other Ranger prospects right now as having that type of upside. Certainly when Igor Shesterkin was coming along, we knew, okay, this guy's going to be the real deal. When they drafted Lafreniere and Kakko, there was obviously hope that they would eventually become that player, superstar players, and obviously that hope is still there. But for Brennan Offman, man, this guy just puts up just stupid video game-esque numbers everywhere he plays, and I'm just curious to see if he can win the Memorial Cup, and also curious to see where he starts next season. I gotta believe we're seeing him in Ranger Blue at some point next season. I don't know if it'll be on opening night, but I think we'll eventually get there, and definitely looking forward to seeing that. One other bit of news here is that per Elliot Friedman, Peter Laviolette is currently in New York, and take that for what you will. Obviously, it could mean that he's interviewing with the team again. It could mean that he's closing in on maybe being the next head coach of the New York Rangers. Obviously, we talked about John Hines in a recent episode, and I'm lukewarm at best to the idea of John Hines. And like I said, anybody that the Rangers hire, I am willing, and I would hope most people would be willing to at least give them a fair chance. I just have to be honest, John Hines is not my top pick, not by a long shot. As I mentioned in our most recent episode, Ranger fans right now are kind of torn between, okay, give me somebody who's new and exciting and has some new ideas and just a fresh voice, somebody that is not part of the NHL coaching carousel. And there's some candidates out there that fit that description. Chris Knobloch obviously being one of them. There's also a contingent of fans that wants to see, somebody who's been there and done that and has won a lot in the NHL and is experienced and has a lot of credibility. In some cases, has won a Stanley Cup. Peter Laviolette fits the description there. So they're torn. But with John Hines, he doesn't. Neither one of those things applies, and he's one of the only candidates where one of those things at least does not apply. So I don't know. We'll see how the whole thing shakes out. It kind of feels right now like probably if I'm ranking like most likely to least likely, I'd probably put Peter Laviolette at number 1. I've kind of had him at number 1 through this whole thing. I'd probably put Hines at number 2 based on what we're hearing the last couple of days, and probably Chris Knobloch at number 3. And everybody else kind of feels like at least something of a long shot at this point. But obviously, we'll see what happens, and we'll continue to track that situation. And then one other thing that I want to mention real quick here, we talked about recently how the Rangers are going to be playing the Islanders at MetLife Stadium, which is where the Mets play, in February. We now know the date of that game. It will happen on Saturday, February 18th. And we also have the Devils playing the Flyers at MetLife Stadium the day before that on Saturday, February 17th. And times for both games are still to be announced. So obviously always a cool thing. And the Rangers, believe they're 4-0 when it comes to these outdoor games ever since the NHL started doing them with regularity. So let's go ahead and make it 5-0 this year against the arch rival New York Islanders. But that will do it for today, guys. Once again, if you'd like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, at @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's at @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to the Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I'll see you next time.